welcome to the Psychedelic podcast. I am excited for you to be here. And today we've been talking with Christian Dockstader, who is the founder of True North Float in Utah. That's a center for floating, ice baths, saunas, massages, and much more good stuff. He's approaching healing from a very physical but also deeply psychological perspective. Today we've been mainly talking about floating and the combination of floating and psychedelics, especially ketamine-assisted therapy. If you're not sure what floating is, floating or going into a float tank, that's a container or a room filled with salt water in which you can experience this state of weightlessness. So you lie suspended in a saltwater solution which has the same temperature as the outside surface of your skin. But before we start this exciting podcast, there are other exciting news. We have just launched our newest product, the Mushroom Tea Ceremony Box. It's open for pre-orders now, and why don't you just have a little look at it yourself? It's made to optimize your set and setting. And yeah, if you feel that this is something that could benefit your life or your personal set and setting, you can save yourself a discount of $100 if you sign up for our lovely newsletter at portiersupplies.com.
Hey Chris, when was actually the first time that you got into a float tank, and where was that, and how did you get into that?
Yeah, great question. This was probably in 2016. I had a buddy dragging me along saying, hey, we got to try this thing. I heard about it on a podcast, and I had no idea what I was getting into at all. And I went to this place in Las Vegas where I was living at the time called Go Float Yourself, which is kind of a funny. They're not around anymore. I don't know if it's because the names sucked, but it was a little place with some float pods, and I tried it out. I remember thinking that there were a couple of moments that I did find to be quite insightful and interesting, but it didn't stick with me in a way where after that experience, I was just sold on floating, and I was going to, continue floating and get a membership and eventually open a business that, offers flotation therapy to my community and that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. So that came later. So I guess I can continue the story. Basically, I tried it out. Maybe 2 years go by, year and a half, 2 years go by. And then I find the Joe Rogan Experience, sort of like start listening to Joe. And, that was funny because my friend who brought me the first time, he had heard about it from Joe, but like I wasn't, on that thread. And then after listening to Rogan talk about it many more times, I was like, shit, there's something here that I must have missed, So, because he always talks about, in the past at least, when he was in the earlier episodes, he would always talk about, edibles and float tanks. And I was like, shit, maybe I should give this another go. And I was also just learning about breathwork at the time. So basically it's sort of a perfect storm where I was just starting to do breathwork. Nevada had just legalized cannabis, and then I had found Joe Rogan. So it's like, okay, we'll give this another burn. And I went to a float center that was by my new house, so this is a different one called True Rest, and I went in there. True Rest Float Spa, yeah, they're kind of the franchisee version in the float industry. They're the franchise that's kind of got the most locations. And I went and popped an edible, took a cold shower, got in the tank, did about, I don't know, maybe 10 minutes, 3 or 4 rounds, 5 rounds of Wim Hof breath.
Right before you went in.
As I'm in the tank. So
as
like laying,
yeah,
like laying in the float tank. So as the edibles are coming on, I'm doing this breath work. And basically that was the float. That was the experience that changed everything for me. And that made me realize that the float tank's kind of a portal that you can use to kind of go into the inner realm or in the inner landscape, the inner frontier, the terra incognita, the unexplored frontier of the human mind and our consciousness. And so, yeah, after that, I was changed and got a float membership, got a yoga membership, which I hadn't practiced yoga at all. It just, that whole experience sort of gave me this new awareness from the inside out of my body and sort of what I had been missing before, what I had forgotten. And that's yeah, that was in 2018, January 2018. So I've been in it for about 5 years.
What kind of membership was that? Like, how regular were you going at that time?
I was going twice a month. And I did that, in yoga I was going, about 3 times a week. And then that only lasted, so I was basically within just a few months of doing that. So started in January. By July, I had purchased a one-way flight to Costa Rica, quit my job, and like I had this like sort of new wings in some kind of way, and so I kind of took a break from floating while I was traveling for a little bit, and then I came back for about 2 months because I needed to have a surgery done. I used to have a metal screw in my left hip, like a long, juicy 3-inch, 4-inch screw. And that was put in when I was 12 years old. And it was actually that first float in January that I mentioned, the one with the edibles, that kind of gave me this epiphany where I realized, like, holy shit, I have this metal screw in my body that's been in there for 12 years. And I think I need to get it out. Like, I don't think it's a good thing. And it was this kind of terrifying, anxiety-ridden sort of experience, right? Where it was like, oh shit, what am I going to do? And then it was 10 months later in October, I'm down in Colombia, staring into the fire on huachuma, which is a cactus medicine. Mescaline is the psychedelic molecule. And, day 7 of a 10-day retreat or something, right? Like done a bunch of ayahuasca and stuff. And I'm like the clearest and like whatever I've ever been. And I'm staring in the fire and all these downloads of just pure confidence of like, you were on the right path. You're exactly doing what you're supposed to be doing. And it just gave me this courage to like, okay, now it's time to go get this screw taken out. And I made that decision. And it wasn't just about the screw either. It was also about this woman who I'm still madly in love with, named Lily, who I had met her like right before I left on this. I already had my flight booked. I had put in my 2 weeks notice. I'm about to leave this job at this bar that I was working at. And she walks in like one day before my last shift. And so we connect right before I leave, and we stayed in contact while I'm traveling. And so this decision with the fire and the medicine was just like, you need to go see Lily. You need to go get this screw taken out. So I went and spent 2 months in Vegas recovering from the surgery. And I just tell that story because that's when I really got deeper into floating as well. I got an unlimited membership. I was floating like 3 times a week because I was rehabbing a significant invasive injury. Like I had that screw taken out and I needed all that recovery,
So the recovery in terms of mental rest or physical rest.
It was actually kind of a combination.
Yeah.
Yeah. So sorry to cut you off.
Hand in hand with each other, but yeah.
Yeah. So basically, I would say the physical was there was some physical trauma, right, and some tension in my body that I had to release, right, like not just the surgery that put the screw in there, but the surgery getting it removed, right. So I needed to just do some physical healing. But what's interesting is. There was this is going to sound trippy, but if you read like Bessel van der Kolk's like Body Keeps the Score, any of this new sort of science out there around sort of embodied sort of emotions and how the body kind of holds the record, it keeps the score, it has sort of the signatures of past traumas and different things like that. And so the first time I floated after having gotten this screw removed, I had like a profound release of. We're going to overshare here. So basically, I was circumcised as a kid, as a baby, and I actually had the embodied trauma of that experience release after I got. It was the trippiest thing, and it was heavy. so that, like, even that stuff, like early days, you know, like that was, you know, from I don't know, 25 years prior, and that was coming out in the float tank. So, you know, I couldn't say it's just a physical healing process. It's definitely like a deeper level to it.
Yeah, it's connected. So there's two questions I immediately got. One is what happened in that first session, and what happened in this consecutive sessions. Could you take people through who've never floated before? You know, what happens when you're sober doing it, and perhaps also we could walk in versus, you know, on psychedelics and how those two intertwine.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a big caveat, which is that I can't say I used to be a lot more I don't know what you call it, maybe reckless, or play a little fast and loose with recommending, you know, people take substances and get in float tanks. And I can't say that as a general blanket recommendation for sure. I think that it's, first of all, not going to be for everyone. And a couple other caveats, you know, like, if you were going to do it, you better be damn comfortable both with the substance you're using and with the float tank separately before you try to bring those things together, you know. And, you know, all the other things, like, you know, you take full responsibility of your own state of consciousness. But I'm a believer that, like, we have sovereignty. It's like inherent to being a human. So, you know, if you don't have sovereignty over your state of consciousness, then you're, what freedoms do you really have, right? So I think that we should have the freedom to explore that, but don't do stupid shit, right? So, but to your point, so for me, I've had many floats sober that have been lovely, that have been amazing, that have been relaxing, that have been insightful, that have been even profound. It's a different, so once I've sort of developed, I would say, kind of like a pathway, which started out with being assisted by cannabis and breath work. So it was the combination of you know, about 10 milligrams of edibles with the Wim Hof breathing that I would do. And sort of what it would do is, like, I would go through that kind of ramping up part of the float at the beginning with the breath work, and as cannabis is coming on, and then I would kind of find myself in this different sort of consciousness, or different sort of way of awareness, of experiencing from sort of a more embodied place, I would say. And it felt like being, John Lilly uses a term which I really like. He calls it, he says, the center of the cyclone, which is sort of like the eye of the storm, where you're kind of in this place of equanimity where you're witnessing, you know, and you might see, like, the pain in your body and the trauma from your past, or you might, whatever it is, you know, and not necessarily be that, it, you know, just be that, but also just be witnessing that. And so I feel like the other thing that's really important about this bridge to this kind of this new pathway that was created for me was it felt like remembering, like, it felt like the body has this sort of intuitive intelligence that sort of has this self-correcting mechanism. It's kind of like an anti-fragile system, right? So as you stress it, as it gets damaged, as it receives feedback from the environment, it updates, right? It corrects. It has this hormetic response. So we get stronger when we work out. And when we receive this sort of, you know, painful experiences or traumatic experiences, those have to be processed, but your body knows how to do that. And so I feel like the float tank's one of the best places to have that level of intimacy and vulnerability with yourself, where, you know, it's the one place in the world, it's just you know what I mean? It's like 100%, it's like anything, you can go anywhere. Like, there's no closet and fucking corner in your, like, you know, in your consciousness that's off limits. Like, you can give yourself permission to you know, pull out the junk drawer and like start letting things go. And so I feel like that's sort of the pathway. I figured out how to get there initially with cannabis, but I don't think you need that. And I don't even think it's the right tool for everybody. So it's kind of complicated. It's not a simple black and white thing. Like you should just do this protocol and everyone should do this, which I used to think. I was a little bit more naive earlier on. I used to think that that would just scale to anybody. But, and maybe there's some, maybe it's like 2 parts protocol and, so like protocol, float tank, and then like 1 part grace. Like I don't really know exactly why it worked for me, but it has seemed to have a big impact on other people as well.
Right.
Yeah, because you offer ketamine sessions as well, right? At True North.
Yeah, well, we work with
but those are not while having the session, right? The float session, those are 2 separate sessions, right?
They're separate services.
Use it more as like an integrative tool to digest the ketamine experience after.
Yeah, so there's kind of 2. Once again, I find myself conflicted, right? Because on the one hand, as a business owner, we're trying to create a sacred and intentional container for even ketamine, like which some people might say it's like, oh, it's not a plant medicine, it's from a lab, etc. I think any of these molecules that have the capacity to help us, experience catharsis and ecstasis, right? Like peak experiences, deep healing and connection, and which ketamine certainly qualifies, I believe, and in fact might be the best one for Westerners. I think it meets Westerners where they're at more than say ayahuasca does, right? It's like, hey, you've got, you're getting a prescription from a doctor, right? So you're going through the channels of like the Western medicine man, right, versus the shaman, and it's also a lot, in my opinion, lighter of an experience. Like it doesn't have the level of I mean, done in the right container, I find ketamine to be incredibly compared to say mushrooms or ayahuasca or something. I find it to be a way smoother ride, if I can put it that way. And so we've tried to create an intentional container and a safe container for that experience, so that people can have a therapeutic, legal, kind of psychedelic experience. And we've sort of paired it with a breathwork protocol, and it's kind of a one-on-one experience with a facilitator. Okay, so that's over here, right? And then over here on this other side is like, okay, not as a business owner, but just as a psychonaut, as somebody who's interested in exploring. I've definitely explored ketamine in the float tank, and I can't sell that as a service due to liability issues, right? Even though technically we could, and I'm actually considering how to pioneer this.
Interesting.
I think it could be done. I think it actually could be done in a way that's both safe, legal, and really powerful and effective.
Would you need somebody to be inside
You might need somebody to be monitoring, but really you might be able to find a way to do that without having a person in the room. So maybe if you had like a wristband or something that was monitoring your biometrics, and you could check on somebody's, heart rate and that kind of thing. And if they had an easy way to call for help or something, right, if they needed it. I don't know. I think it's worth exploring, because I think that, if you think about John Lilly, the guy that invented the float tank, he was doing ketamine in the float tank, right? So like he was,
really?
You could argue he went a little too deep, but he's definitely, there's been that kind of history of it from the beginning. And I think there's something there for sure. But the question is, how do you make it safe? How do you make it intentional? And how do you create the right kind of integration so that people don't just keep, hitting the pleasure buttons or going back to the wishing well, trying to just like get that, next hit.
Yeah. That was, I had my first float tank experience about 2 weeks ago. And when I was in there, I felt like I was on ketamine. It really felt like a ketamine experience to me. And I was like, after I was contemplating, like, how deep into relaxation could you potentially go with the help of ketamine inside a float tank? And
I can answer that a little bit.
Explore the void, like to new degrees.
Yeah, I'm very curious about like what is a lot of people have experience with ketamine, some have with floating, but both. Like how yeah, what's the added bonus here?
Yeah. So ketamine sort of, for me, and it also is obviously we're talking about like dose dependent, right? Like the difference between a medicine and a poison or a toxin is dose, right? So we don't want to like just say this applies to any dose. For me, taking like 1 to 200 to max 300 milligrams of oral ketamine, which is going to be way less bioavailable. So we're talking about like a liftoff dose, but not like a crazy dissociative type of experience where, and once again, I can't even say that that's the case for everyone because everyone's physiology is different. But for me, that's the dose that I feel like I'm in the experience, but I haven't lost total motor function in my body. I'm not in the K-hole. I'm not completely gone. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
So I feel it's totally safe. Like I wouldn't take anything in a body of water where I felt like I wasn't in control. You see what I mean? Because the last thing you want to do is lose motor function while you're in water. That's a recipe for drowning. It's a bad idea.
Do you know of any accidents that happened? Are you aware of any complications that happened?
There are some deaths that have happened in float tanks that were associated with drugs, ketamine, but I don't think they were actually because somebody like went face down in the water and drowned. From what I can understand, from what I read, it sounds like there was two guys, and both of them. It seemed like the complication came because they mixed the wrong things, and so they died, but they were face up, in the float tank. They weren't face down in the water. It wasn't the cause of death. So yeah, I don't think. I mean, I think you should with anything, right? Like if you have any modality, any tool, enough people are going to do it. Eventually, you're going to end up with some deaths, right?
Yeah.
But we're talking about a tiny, tiny, tiny percentage. I mean, we're talking about like a couple people, and I think there was another older lady who might have like slipped and hit her head. That was a sad tragedy. So there's been like 3 accidents, or maybe a handful of accidents. But yeah, obviously, I'm really cautious. I'm not trying to be reckless about it, and so even in talking about it, I feel like on the one hand I feel conflicted because it's like I want to share, as a psychonaut and sort of an explorer, I want to talk about this openly, and then on the other hand, it's like I don't want to recommend it as a blanket policy to people because I don't think that would be safe, right?
Yeah, 100%. We're also aligned on that. That's also our thing. But we definitely break through that. Everybody knows, general safety. Our audience is quite smart and mature. And they're heavy trippers, usually, very advanced. But this is probably a combination that they haven't done yet. Now we're not saying like they should do, but I think people are very interested, like what is it like?
Have you ever done DMT in a full tank?
I have not, no. See, that's one where I don't feel like if it would be the best pairing, you know what I mean? Because it's like you want to be able to let go, right? And so you got to feel comfortable in the environment. Yeah. And I've just never really even had and I have access to DMT. I just haven't had the desire to go in the tank with it. You know what I mean? And honestly, like I find generally that you don't need a lot. So like if anyone's wondering like how do I want to explore this, what do I do? Start low. Start with nothing. Go float sober. Make sure you floated and you understand that environment and that you're comfortable in the environment. And honestly too, like this is a delicate one because you really need to be in the right kind of place. Like so I went and literally built the right space for me, right? Like we opened a wellness business with really beautiful float rooms that I can go in when we're closed and I can have access to a beautiful space and not have to worry about pissing off the staff because I'm in there for 3 hours. You know what I mean? Like I can just make it the container suit what I need it to be. And So yeah, the more complicated dynamics when you're like just buying a float at a space, right?
Yeah.
And then you're not supposed to be on anything, and you are, and there's sort of like this tension there and this paranoia, like that kind of stuff. So it's not optimal. So ideally, you'd have a good relationship with, say, the float center owner or something like that, and you could, have an honest conversation about what you're doing in a way that's like more intentional, and you just create the right container for it, right? I think the container is really important. But you asked a question earlier about, what is the reason to do that? What is it like putting those two things together? And ketamine, as you probably already know, like you've experienced it, is a very voidy type of a molecule. It feels like the float tank just allows you to just fall into it even more in that sense. And so like one example of this would be like getting to this kind of center point of stillness where, just the time in between breaths, like when you're not breathing, feels like a vast expanse of like emptiness. You know what I mean? Where you're just in like this total void of everything, like no thoughts, nothing. It's just void. And there's something about that that's incredibly blissful. Just the piece of that, of just, and then I think we have like this kind of pathological fear of death and this fear of not existing or no thing. And when you experience that and it's blissful and you're like, wow, it's kind of empowering, like if the lights go off and if everything stops, who's to say that's like a terrifying or a bad thing,
And what is that attributed to? Because in the easiest sense, your sensories are deprived. But could you tell a little bit more about the cause and effect?
Yeah. So you mean with the floating mechanism or with ketamine?
Yeah, with the floating mechanism.
Yeah. So I wouldn't call it sensory deprivation, actually. I'm trying to rebrand that as much as possible.
Okay.
And I think that, that's been first voiced by, what's his name? Michael somebody who wrote the book on floating. And the reason I wouldn't call it deprivation is because you still have sensory awareness. And it's not like you lose your ability to sense. You actually get more attuned. So if anything, it's sensory attenuation, where you actually feel, deeper on a more embodied level. So if I'm not seeing the sun and feeling the wind and hearing all the cars, and I'm just in the float tank, then what happens is my awareness turns to my heartbeat, my awareness turns to my breath, my awareness turns to the electricity of my nervous system, and maybe the energy level of like the energy body, right? The subtle body. And that's why that first float in January of 2018 was so profound for me, because I discovered my energy body for the first time. I was like, holy fuck, there's an energy body? I mean, I didn't even have a word for it. I didn't know what it was. And that's why I got the yoga practice, was because when I started Googling to find out what it was, that was the closest explanation that I could find, was this sort of chakra system, the nadis or the energy meridians that run through the body, and it's like, holy shit, these Eastern philosophies are much older, and they've kind of mapped this from a long time ago, and ki and prana and these words that describe the flow of life force through the body, and this energetic sort of field and this energetic, system. And discovering that without like having any context for it's kind of a wacky, trippy experience. It's very psychedelic, and so that was a paradigm shift for me, for sure. And I would just say that the float tank is a great environment to light up the inner world. So if you think you're going to experience absolutely nothing, you're in for a totally different experience, because really it's a mirror that like everything you experience is coming from within you, right? Other than maybe the slight feeling of the water, or if some salt dries on your chest or something, like you might experience a little sensory from the float tank, but most of what your experience is internal. And so I think you just kind of tune into that more, and it's not really a deprived or a deprivation experience.
Hey, I hope you're enjoying this episode so far. This is a little reminder that we have just launched our new mushroom ceremony box. So have a look at portiersupplies.com and see if this is something that could benefit your psychedelic experience.
How do you share that wisdom with the people who come to the True North float? Like, do you have some sort of protocol? How do you, because obviously you want them to have like not just the average floating experience, but you want them to, help them develop. Like, what is do you have a certain kind of structure that, or certain kind of conversations before you send people in there, or how do you approach that?
It's a good question. This is kind of the $1 million question too. It's hard, harder than I thought it would be to bridge sort of. I mean, so first of all, I'm opening up. So I'm from a little town near St. George, Utah. So I grew up in a really small little bubble of a fundamentalist Mormon town, and then I left when I was 20, and kind of came full circle, traveled around the world, came back to start True North Float, and I chose St. George because it's kind of I've got roots there. I'm from that area, but I didn't pick a progressive market. I picked the place I came from. So basically, what we're doing is we're planting kind of a seed and building some architecture that's, when we opened, is so far off of people's radar. Like, it was 9 out of 10 people, I got to explain what a float tank is, or why you would cold plunge. Like, nobody, everyone's just like, hey, wait, sorry, what? And especially we're still trying to get ketamine going, like, get people to book it. You see what I mean? Like, so we're kind of on the edge, the frontier. So that conversation of how do you get a first time floater to go from, I have no idea what this is or what to expect, to like, wow, this is really powerful tool that I want to keep using to benefit my life. That is a trick and a challenge. Just getting people to want to try it in the first place is a challenge. So, because you got to do a lot of education. So I don't think we've nailed that process of like, having a super high percentage of people who come in for a first time experience and who walk away, with a membership. Like, we're still trying to dial that in. And I would also say it really depends a lot on like when someone's ready for it, like as soon as you're on that part of your journey in your life where you're ready for something different, and you're curious about like what are the other possibilities, and you want to get out of the, say, monotonous sort of cycles of just like work during the week and grind so that you can drink and watch football on the weekend, and then you can sort of like repeat the cycle and start over on Monday with your nicotine and your caffeine and do the whole thing over again. So like, if you want to kind of get off the hamster wheel, floating is an amazing way to interrupt that, and just put everything on pause and stop get you out of the river, the torrent, the momentum of the society and the culture and the ideological thinking and the politics and all the bullshit, and just get away from all that noise and interrupt it. As you guys know, psychedelics do that as well, but floating is a great non-pharmacological intervention that can also be a little bit more sustainable, right? Like, if I floated every week, I can get that reset regularly without necessarily having to ingest a molecule.
Yeah, I can totally see that.
How was it for you, your first time session?
I mean, I was very tired that day, so I arrived at the floating center, and I really slept bad the night before, so I went in there like really tired. But for me, the great experience was just to like ease in with this tiredness. I don't know. I really had this like fantastic experience of just like accepting that I'm tired and letting go of like my identification with being tired. I don't know. That was sort of like one of my key realizations, that I don't have to, just every experience is great. And I just had my experience, like the physical experience of, what it feels like to be in this tank. I experienced it so consciously that I just became friends with whatever I felt like, and I was seeing my mind like like really disconnected from my body as well. That was like another thing which was really interesting. I was really like, I really stepped into some observer role of how my mind functions, and yeah, I kind of saw it from like really far away, and yeah, it just made me feel incredibly relaxed and content and accepting of whatever is going on in this moment. And like it happened so quickly. I wasn't there for an hour, and it just I couldn't believe that the time was gone. It was a fantastic experience. How long do you usually send people? Like, what's like? Is like an hour like a standard time?
I'm glad you asked that. We used to. So we started out with 60-minute floats, which so sort of the different in the industry, you'll see either 60 or 90, or you'll see both, right? Those are the sort of it's either an hour, it's an hour and a half, or it's some combination of both. We started out with 60-minute floats, and after running those for a year, our number one feedback was kind of what you just said about it ending really quickly, and people, like right as you start to get to this deeper state, you've kind of let the weight go and you've sort of dropped in, and then the float sort of comes to an end. And so we decided to take the advice of our friends at Float On in Portland and switch to 90 minutes floats, which they run exclusively 90-minute floats. And at first that seems like a big commitment and a big leap up, but I think it's important that because you can always get out early, right? Like if you feel satisfied and you're like, I had a great float and now I'm alert and I'm energized and I'm ready to get out of here, and I get out at 60 minutes or I get out at 75 minutes or whatever, there's nothing wrong with that. And there's been several floats where I've kind of decided to get out early, but when you're in that state and you want to stay in that state and you're going deeper and you're maybe unraveling something profound, or you're having some insight or some inspiration, and then the lights, the float ends and you're kind of pulled out of it, that sucks. So we wanted to give people enough space to go deeper, and we think that last 30 minutes, that kind of back half of the float is really really where the magic happens. So I would say changing to 90 minutes. And then also really encouraging new people, first timers, to float 3 times at least. So we give people a 3-pack first time floater package of 3 floats, and we really encourage that they go the distance to float number 3, and to the point where we're like, hey, if you float all 3 times and you're like, this sucks, I want my money back, we'll totally just give you your money back.
Right.
Nobody's going to say that if they float 3 times. You know what I mean? Because if you think about it, we come in with these like kind of caked, hardened exterior shells. If you think about how much stimulation there is in the world, how much craziness is going on right now, you kind of have to develop some layer of like a thickness to it, like a thick skin. And so to go into the opposite of that experience, where it's like, not only are you not blocking out the noise, but like now all of a sudden everything is sort of heightened, like your inner experience is heightened. And that can be, if someone's dealing with a lot of anxiety, the idea of just going and being alone with themselves for 90 minutes sounds kind of terrifying. Yeah. So what we did is and I recommend anybody who's looking into creating a float business, you definitely want to create an environment that's not scary, that's not intimidating. So you want to create either open style float rooms or big spacious float cabins. Like ours are 6 feet by 8 feet by 8 feet. So
that means you're not in
chambers.
A chamber that's being closed, but just like a room that has like a...
Yeah, exactly. You don't want a little pod. Pods are claustrophobia inducing for some people. I mean, and some float enthusiasts prefer the pods, which is fine. So if you want to have a combination of both or whatever, but we found that like number one is like you want to show people this is not a scary place. You can have control of the lights. We even have underwater headphones that people can listen to tracks, guided meditations, breath work, and that kind of helps people ease into their float journey and go through that kind of initial learning curve where they're dealing with how to be in this inner space that might have a bunch of unresolved stress and emotion and anxiety, and you kind of have to process it. And especially when you're processing like real trauma, it can be intense. And so you want to give people like the right space and the container that they feel safe to go through all that,
What's the longest you've ever been in a float tank?
Probably 5 or 6 hours.
Wow. In one go.
But honestly, I've only done that once. And for me, like 3 hours seems to be kind of the sweet spot if I want to go for a long float. Like, so I won't float longer than 90 minutes if I'm sober. Like, if I'm sober, 90 minutes is perfect. If I'm doing a visionary float, is sort of what I call them. With a visionary float, I'll go 3 hours and then sometimes longer.
1 second, camera is off. So I think it's because of the call again. Sometimes we have to restart after somebody calls me on. That's so.
No worries.
Wow, 3 hours seems like an incredible time to be in a float tank. I can only imagine like where you go. So visionary, you mean like on
some sort of substances, yeah. So typically,
mushrooms.
like I said, I would start low, but you don't need a lot. Like even just a half a gram, to a gram of psilocybin, or of psilocybin mushrooms, not just pure psilocybin. That would be crazy. But like just a gram or half a gram, it's enough to really like enhance the experience and take you in on for me at least, and I'm pretty sensitive to mushrooms, but it takes me into a visionary sort of journey, but I'm not so blasted that I can't handle myself. I'm in total control. Right. So you can I really like the idea of using the float tank as a place to sort of enhance those lower dose journeys. And then if I'm going to go into a high dose journey, like a heroic dose, I want to be outside of the float tank. I want to be, I'm going to be on my bed with a blindfold or something like that.
And just helping after the session. Perhaps.
Yeah, I don't think doing a bunch, like a high dose of psychedelics in the tank's a great idea unless you're going to be like supervised or something like that,
I found it to be very visual already just sober. I felt I had a lot of visuals already, like open eye visuals.
Yeah.
After just 1 hour, I started to see like blue jellyfishes, and I don't know, it was kind of
cool.
visual already.
Have you guys ever explored the combination of cannabis and ketamine?
Yeah. I truly enjoyed that, to be honest. You that, I guess.
I have not. No, not really.
So I agree. I find that to be some of my favorite, most insightful, and most inspiring sessions that I've experienced with any visionary molecules. That combination feels like it just goes together, like almost like a puzzle piece fitting together.
Yeah.
And that in the float tank is incredibly profound. So that's I would say my sort of go-to sort of protocol, visionary protocol, and it would start with first creating the intentional container, and everyone's going to have to do this in their own way and what feels good to you and what you have available to you. For me, I have a float center available to me, so it's easy for me to go in on a day we're closed and the space is locked up, and I can light my incense, and I can create the whole ceremonial intentional container and journal and use the tarot and do whatever else I want to do to set myself up for a good experience. And then I'll take about 10 milligrams of oral cannabis, and then about 30 minutes later, so I use that 30 minutes to create my setup and my intentions going in, and then about 30 minutes after taking the cannabis, I'll take the oral ketamine lozenges, which I would recommend you have a prescription. So I wouldn't do any of this stuff illegally. What's crazy is you can do all of this legally. Like you can take legal cannabis, legal ketamine
in the States,
and there's depending on where you are, and if you have a prescription for it, you totally can. Which I totally recommend you do it through the proper channels, and you make sure it's it's all kosher and safe. And
Yeah.
once again, don't do it like all this at once. Like experience the stuff out of the float tank first, and experience the float tank many times first before you blend things together. But that's kind of the protocols. As I'm kind of getting into the float, I've taken the cannabis 30 minutes ago. I take the oral ketamine as I go into the float tank, and I go in for 3 hours, and that's to me where I get some access to some really profound kind of novel information, which has, if you can integrate it, and this is the trick, like ketamine's tricksy, and you see people kind of fall into these. I mean, with any psychedelics too, it can be tricky, where people fall into sort of delusions of grandeur and even mania if you keep going back. And so I think Jamie Wheel, I don't know if he's on your guys' radar, but what he's doing with Flow Genome Project, and he wrote a book called Recapture the Rapture. He's a really got some good wisdom with this, and he has this practice called hedonic calendaring, where you kind of calendar in and schedule in your peak states for, say, the year. So it's like I can kind of create the rhythm and the cadence that makes sense, and it's sort of like a liberating structure. It gives me the ability to say, okay, I can kind of get lost in my life and just focus on, my job, my relationships, my day-to-day, like just get fully into my life, knowing that like on the solstice, I'm going to have this peak experience, maybe at a festival, or maybe a visionary experience in a float tank, or whatever my calendar thing is, right? That's going to pull me back into this remembering of like the bigger picture and like what I'm here to do. And, you can set these up on like a lunar cycle or whatever rhythm sort of feels right. But for me, I found that like I need that structure, because it's tempting to want to just go back to the wishing well, especially when you own a float center, right? And it's like, oh, I can go do ketamine floats as much as I want, right? And it's like I have to create that structure for myself. So for me, I'm looking at it right now more as like a quarterly practice, something like that, where it's like a solstice equinox type reset that gives me a wider lens perspective on my reality.
Yeah.
But then you have like an ongoing breathwork practice, or
yeah. So the whole idea with hedonic calendaring is you take sort of the lower effort, lower risk, but also kind of lower reward practices, and those go into daily or weekly practices, right? So that would be your breath work, your cold plunging, your yoga, all of those good things that feel like they should be done pretty often, right? And then you can take kind of higher effort, higher risk, or more expensive, or whatever it is, right? And you can kind of start to sprinkle those in, either like on a Sabbath practice, like a Sunday, or a monthly practice, like a lunar cycle, maybe ceremony. See, floating, depending on your budget, floating seems to land somewhere between the weekly to monthly phase. Some people, like I've definitely been in that phase where I floated every week, and sometimes it's just like people want to float once a month, or that's what they can afford. So, that kind of seems to be the cadence for floating for me. But then, you go into like your psychedelics and your festivals and your travel, your international travel, your bigger experiences, your bucket list items, and those are going to land somewhere between like the quarterly or the annual, right? So just the higher risk, higher reward, higher effort, those are gonna be less frequent, and you kind of just calendar those in on the bigger things, right? So it's kind of a spectrum.
Fantastic. Gosh, I wish I had my own float tank at home. I mean, if I would probably use it way too often. But yeah, it would be great. But yeah, it's probably pretty hard to build a thing like this for yourself, or to buy it. It's probably quite pricey, yeah?
It's a technical environment. It's really quite difficult to do it right. Even float businesses, where it's their job, it's their business to create a float experience, a lot of them don't do it perfectly. Like you'll be in the float tank and you'll be hearing the gym next door because you can't soundproof out the weights dropping, or whatever, right? Like there's a lot of technical hard problems to solve when you're building a space like that. So I would say, if I was looking for, I mean, unless I have the resources aren't an issue and you can have someone come in and build you a really nice float environment, it's probably going to run you like 40 or 50 grand to really build a nice one, because you need to soundproof it, you need to light proof it, salt proof it. You want to have a big float tank. You don't want to have a small little pod. So for me, like our float rooms are about 40, 50 grand each. You could probably go a little cheaper, than that, but I like nice things. So that's the problem with floating. The other thing I would just throw out there, I know this is, a podcast for psychedelics, but I would say cold plunging is arguably going to give you more bang for your buck if you had a cold plunge that you had access to. So if I was looking to put something at my house, I would get a cold plunge because I can do that every day. And that's going to like massively level up my life. And, way, way lower barrier to entry. You can get a cold plunge for a couple grand and just, set it up. Or even just get a tub and buy ice.
You have a cold plunge for how much?
$100, $50, but you have to buy ice, right? Especially where you are in Arizona. You got to go to the grocery store and get ice every day, or
no? I mean, you have like the cold plungers that you just plug in and they just keep it.
Oh, really?
Like, yeah, I mean, you can also just like transform it like a fridge into a cold plunge, right?
Yeah, I'd be careful with that one because if you're refitting a freezer, a chest freezer, to be a cold plunge, don't do stupid shit. Don't get electrocuted because they're not designed to be full of water, right? They're designed to chill food. So you got to be careful, just be smart. But yeah, that's the cheaper way to go. Is a lot of people do that with chest freezers. So I'm sure you could find a good guide for that on the internet and be safe about it. But I think the lower end cold plunges on the market are probably between $2-3 grand. And they'll filter, they'll chill it, they'll do all that. You can get all the way up, to 10-15 grand for a cold plunge, depending on how nice you want to go.
Yeah, the filtering is that's probably also like with the float tanks, that takes probably quite an advanced system to keep it all clean and fresh.
Yeah, especially in a commercial context, where you got bodies going through it a lot. You got to have the really nice high-end equipment. If you're just using it for personal use, a cheaper setup probably would be okay.
So what kind of like salts are you using, or what kind of magnesium?
We use medical
right?
Yeah, we use food grade Epsom salt. So it's just magnesium sulfate. Yeah.
I'm still a little bit curious because we talk about the practicalities and the safety and everything, but we heard about your first experience. But obviously, you've had a couple hundred float sessions under your belt, if not over 1,000. A couple thousand, maybe. I don't know.
No, I would say it's probably under 1,000, but definitely hundreds.
Okay. Yeah. So, is there any anecdotes? Like, do you have any? You step in the tank, you prep with either medicine or without. Are there any experience that really stick out other than the physical one, where you had to take out the bolt, or where people enter this deep relaxation from society? Is there anything else that really sticks out for you?
For sure. I mean, I could go all day on anecdotes of powerful float insights or downloads that I've come out with, including coming out and writing poetry. It just depends, right? Like, I guess I'll just try to think of like a relevant one. So, more recently, where I've been at with it, right? Right now, I'm in the process. So, True North for me started out in a float tank in 2018. The idea came in as like, oh, well, I'm a kid that just lost his sort of tribe and community and whole sort of founding or foundational philosophy on life, because I grew up in a Mormon cult, like a fundamentalist little community. And so leaving that, I was sort of starting over. And then, coming into the workplace and capitalism and sort of America, just chasing money for 5 years and doing that whole thing and partying a lot in Vegas. And that's where I lived. Like, realizing that that's not really the meaningful life that I'm trying to live. And so I'm really just like at this phase in my life looking for answers, right? And so I get this idea in the float tank. I need to find true north. Like I need to go on a journey or to try to reorient myself and sort of discover where to go from here. And so I used that metaphor of true north and started a blog and took off to South America, like I said, started traveling and started exploring these different modalities of wellness and healing and practices and medicines. And then circling back to Utah to build the wellness center. And that's when True North Project sort of evolved into a podcast versus the blog, because I found that was a little more natural medium for me. And it allowed me to connect with others like this, which I really enjoy. And so now that podcast has given me, it's sort of gone on its own journey, and it's sort of evolved more, right? It started out just primarily being around wellness stuff because that's what I was into. That's what I was focusing on. But now it's really expanded a lot more than that. And so to bring this back to your question, my floats recently have been a lot more zoomed out, thinking about more the general fate of humanity and the coordination failure that Allen Ginsberg calls Moloch. It's like the multipolar trap. It's the race to the bottom. It's the tragedy of the commons, right? It's the arms race. It's the reason that we have nuclear proliferation and tension between, Russia and the West and whatnot. And so, like, I'll have a ketamine float where I experience the nuclear winter that's coming if we fuck this up. You see what I mean? Like, actually feeling that reality of, like, the interdimensional possibility space of, like, holy shit, we really could take this off the rails and destroy life on this planet. And feeling the cry from our ancestors and our future descendants, begging us to figure this one out and to not drop the ball on this one, So, like, that's a powerful, almost like sacred responsibility that we're holding, right? And to feel that viscerally in a float vision where, like, you see ancestors coming to you, like, no, will you take this responsibility on, right? Like, will you consciously do something about this, right? Then you come out of that float, you're like, fuck, I was just trying to, like, start a wellness business and now I'm thinking about, like, Moloch and nuclear proliferation and the tragedy of the commons and all this kind of stuff. And AI is just ratcheting that up even more. So, that's sort of shifted my whole trajectory. And I'm interested in trying to figure out how to solve this coordination failure so that we can make effective collective choices and start sort of orient towards a more protopian and beautiful world that we can kind of all collectively imagine and manifest together. So that's sort of one example of how floating recently has shifted my perspective and my trajectory. But it can be I don't want to make it sound like it needs to be this grandiose thing, because even if you get the insight that you need to go talk to your mom, or you need to, like, spend more time with your partner, or you need to spend more time at the gym. Like, no matter, you're going to get what you need. You know what I mean? It doesn't need to look a certain way, but it's just most likely going to be what you need.
Wow. Where do you see the future of True North in a world that's, like you already touched upon, is continuously being more emerged into the powers of AI and virtual reality? What role will your wellness center, or I don't know if you're planning to build other wellness centers, or what role will that play in the lives of people in, like, a future that's going to be completely different from what we have right now?
Yeah, that's the $1 million question, right? Like, what do you even build, given that, how uncertain, what we're going into this next chapter of the Anthropocene, with, like, the machine world that's being born and all of that. And this is a really hard design problem, right? Like, really, I think it's important to map the problem space as effectively as possible and do some sense making as what do we actually need, and what should we build collectively? And so for me, like, I've pointed to it already, but to me, the sort of meta problem that translates to everywhere, and that if we could solve this problem would then allow us to solve all the other wicked problems that we face, including climate change and all of our inequality and sort of these other tragedies of the commons. Like, the problem that we need to solve, I think, first is, how do you do effective, group coordination? How do we get to a place where kind of like how we had when we were at the Dunbar level of hunter-gatherer society, you had coherence at the level of the tribe, right? At the level of the, and back then it was limited by who you can actually know relationally. Like I can only know so many people. So that was sort of the hard limit on how big a tribe can get. And as soon as it gets beyond who I can know, then we break into multiple groups. But we got to this new game where it's like, now we're doing global shit, right? Like, there's a globalization and an interconnected world and global economic, political, social, everything. And, the internet and AI and all the rest. So how do we figure out how to coordinate in this space? Because it's actually critical. And if we don't coordinate, we don't figure this out, then, we're on a race to the bottom currently. Well, that's the kind of hard pill to swallow. And so I'm trying to figure out with True North how to actually put this into practice with a actual test case, like an actual use case and an example. So my goal is to, yes, continue expanding what I would call transformational wellness architecture, where you can kind of create the eudaimonia center or the physical spaces where humans can come in where they're at, and it'll meet them where they're at with their trauma, with their distractedness and their anxiety and everything else, their disconnection, their suicidal ideation, all the rest, the shit that we're dealing with, and meet those people and help them orient in a new way. In other words, help them find their true north and go on a healing journey and a self-discovery journey and a transformational journey that ultimately culminates in them becoming a live player, somebody who's consciously engaged with their reality as the self-authoring creator of it, instead of as a victim who's responding to the sort of circumstances that they were started in. And so live players playing an infinite game, as James Carse would say, not the finite game of I win at the cost of you losing, but the infinite game of the point is to play. And let's bring people into the playing of a better game. So that's kind of the jam with the architecture that we're trying to build. And on the level of the social level of this architecture, I'm trying to create a bridge where we go from me as a business owner to us as a collective, right? A cooperative collective of sovereign creatives, right? That's sort of the vision, and so there's a lot of kind of exploring and sense making and problem solving to do to make that happen in a way that doesn't go off the rails or turn into some sort of culty cold or something like that. So there's some treacherous terrain, I think, that we got to figure out how to navigate. But the goal would be to have these collectives that we can sort of create a blueprint where we can go start this wellness architecture and create these collectives and start localizing the initiative, localizing the wave of transformation. And so it's built around your community. It's not some ephemeral, internet thing. It's no, you go into your community wellness center and you reconnect with other human beings.
Yeah, that's a very powerful goal, and it's for me, it's kind of magical because you guys reached out of the blue for us. We're just a company based in Amsterdam, and suddenly you get an email from people in the desert in Nevada. But
Utah.
it's cool. Sorry, Utah. It's so cool to see. For us, it's also we're just building a box or boxes and these kits. But it's about empowerment, right? And about having people. For us, it's not necessarily healing, but I think it's a beautiful thing that it starts with a floating center or it starts with a box, but we're working on bigger things, and that's how we have some kind of shared commitment or shared passion. I think it's really incredible that somehow already this community is kind of connecting then, from the desert of Utah to here in Amsterdam. Yeah, I really see your mission thrive already. What I do see is though, sometimes with my psychedelics, I see people go very far and deep into the cosmos, and they kind of let go of the reality. Is that something that you fear as well with floating?
Yeah, so I kind of pointed to this before when I was saying the hedonic calendaring, right? And not just being in this loop of always trying to hit the pleasure buttons or the novelty buttons and always going back to the wishing well, right? Where, I'll just go, consult the Galactic Federation or something, right? Like I end up in this sort of like loop or this rabbit hole where I fall down into where I'm not part of shared reality anymore. You know what I mean? Like I lose my grounding in shared reality. And then that can kind of lead to really narcissistic or kind of mania type behavior where, you're the one who has like the secret sauce for the world, and, you're kind of in this tier all by yourself. So you got to be really cautious. And I think as this psychedelic renaissance is unraveling, we got to be really conscious about how we create the cultural container for these molecules. Because, if you look at like the Eleusinian mysteries and these sort of mystery traditions of the past, these were very sacred containers where it was actually like punishable by death to take the kukion outside of the tradition. You know what I mean? Like it was revered and protected, and it was like high consequence to go messing around. So I think, we got to figure that one out. And I would say, yes, 100%, I would be concerned about people using the float tank as their escape from reality. I think it's important that we have these sort of, we punctuate our lives with these periods of introspection and yin and relaxation and presence, right? But not get lost in like the sauce where hey, I want to just keep going back to either the float tank or my meditation practice, my cushion, or psychedelics or whatever to kind of escape from my reality. I want to use it in a way that empowers me to actually create my reality in the way that that I desire. And I think on that note, there's a sort of project we got to do, which is the decriminalization of desire, because I think we live in a world where it's like, the idea of desire is kind of, I grew up very religious, so it's kind of like a swear word in a way. And if you, and I've done this, luckily I found floating because it's helped me tune into my more authentic self, which is to then help me clarify what I desire, and if you feel into what is it you actually want, right? Do you want to just go and like hit all the pleasure buttons and be a lizard brain fuck monkey, as Jamie Will would say, right? Like, I think we go through maybe a phase where it's like, we're in our early 20s and we're crushing beer bongs and we're doing the thing, and it's like, yeah, maybe that lasts for a little while, but ultimately that's not, I don't think what anyone really desires as a permanent state. And so being able to clarify your desire and not be in shame about having desire, but actually using desire as the sort of cosmic creative force of life, like the erotic sort of sexual energy of the universe that's driving and animating life. And, it's the reason that, we do anything. So like, you might as well do what you fully desire. And I think as you listen to desire and as you clarify that, you actually begin to get closer and closer to the actual unique thing that only you can do, which would be ikigai. That would be like where you're here to fulfill it for the collective and for life, and no one else can do it because no one else is you.
Mm-hmm. That's beautiful.
Yeah, that's powerful. And I hope people get closer to that, using their prana or their life force for beautiful things, because that's initially what we all want, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Beautiful, guys. Well, I feel
Great.
like that's a good spot to wrap it. Yeah.
I guess so too. There was a wonderful conversation, and yeah, I feel a lot more enlightened on floating.
Thanks so much for listening, guys. If you enjoyed this episode, please like and subscribe. And if you are curious about a new mushroom ceremony box, head to portiersupplies.com and save yourself a sweet little discount. Much love.